We are delighted to be joined today by Ted Gorton, who will talk to us about his new novel, Only the Dead. I've asked Ted to tell us something a little about himself, and to explain the genesis of his book and its storyline. Please welcome Ted.
Well, thank you very much for coming, and especially thank you to the Armenian Institute for suggesting this. I spent several years of my youth in Turkey, of all places. I then went on to live around the Middle East and took a PhD in Arabic literature. I taught Arabic studies at St Andrews in Scotland. You might be amused to think of a Texan teaching Arabic to the Scots, but that's what it was for a while anyway. But then I went to live in the Arab world for many years, including Beirut during two phases of the Civil War, back in the mid-1970s and then again in the early 1980s. I've published several non-fiction books about different aspects of the Middle East, from translations of Arabic poetry to anthologies of travel writing, and most recently a biography of a 17th century Druze prince. The idea of this book didn't come from any desire to write fiction or to be a novelist, but from the opportunity I had while living in Beirut to hear first-hand accounts of the years of the massacres, especially from one elderly Armenian many years ago, a man from Aleppo like Vartan, but this is not in any way his story. He merely provided the seed that grew into an obsession, and finally this book. For years after leaving Beirut, I dreamed about trying to tell a story that reflects the tragic destiny of the Armenians of Cilicia, the helpless anguish of their cousins in Aleppo and elsewhere. This is a historical novel, and like many such, draws on personal contacts, research and memoirs of people who were involved in the momentous events of the time. The character and adventures of my book's protagonist, I should add, his name is Vartan Nakashian, are entirely fictional, but I hope not entirely improbable. Anyway, the structure of the book is an alternation between Vartan as an old man and Vartan as a young man. As a young man, he gets involved in the resistance movement against the massacres and goes on to have other adventures, entirely imaginary, if you like, and then becomes, at the end of his life, an old, rather bitter man living in Beirut by himself, reflecting on his life and all the things that he's done, some of which he's proud of and some of which he's not. So there's a kind of jumping in time, if you like. Now, I'll read two little extracts, not too little, but I hope not too long either. Vartan is carrying what looks like a basket of figs through the ancient souk of Aleppo, now sadly destroyed. In fact, he's been recruited by young resistance fighters trying to hinder the Ottomans in their program of deportation and extermination. The souk was still crowded, it being a Thursday. Tomorrow would be the Muslim Sabbath. I felt eyes staring at me from all sides. Surely someone was going to guess that I was not delivering dates. Shouts of buying, selling, bargaining filled the close atmosphere of the enormous covered market. The empire's at war, I thought. People are dying not so far from here, and look at all these Aleppines busy buying a bar of soap as though their life depended on it. Suddenly my thoughts were roughly interrupted as something shoved me forward, nearly causing me to drop the basket. I clutched the wicker handle with both hands and lurched out of the way, relieved to see it was only a muzzle shove by a donkey, bristling with a clattering bouquet of tin pots and kettles. A barefoot boy was hurrying it along, whacking its backside with a stick and shouting, "Balak, watch your head." It was hot, more like July than late May. This year is in a hurry to get somewhere, I thought, God knows where. The long walk with my heavy burden made me sweat profusely, irritating rivulets running down my forehead under my black felt cap and continually fogging up my glasses. I told myself that's all it was, heat, not fear, though I was afraid, my stomach in a knot, an acrid taste in my mouth. How did I get here? Why did I jump into this crazy mission without thinking, as usual? An Armenian caught carrying bombs through the bazaar at this stage in the war. Best not to think what would happen if I got caught. Not just to me, but to Mayrig and the children. I was soon passing the ancient Armenian church of 40 martyrs, with its ugly modern belfry stuck on. I never saw it without thinking of the 40 thieves in the Aladdin story. I was close to home now, and did not mind that it was pitch dark by the time I entered the tangled lanes of Atawi Zagir, our small and mostly Armenian neighborhood. I climbed the outside staircase to the front door, above the vaulted abu where my late father, a gunsmith, had had his workshop. Mayrig opened the door before I could knock and looked around carefully before closing it, to make sure I'd not been followed. "Did you have any trouble, Varo?" she inquired, after kissing me on both cheeks. She left her wrinkled hand on my shoulder a little longer than usual. "No, Mayrig, all went smoothly. But where are the shabab, the young men?" "In the cellar. Bring the basket." We went down the stone staircase to the ground floor, then across the workshop to a door revealing spiral stairs down into the basement, the cool, dry room where the housewives of Aleppo keep their precious provisions. Our cellar had a further secret room, a small windowless space behind a heavy oak wardrobe. This had been pushed aside to expose the improvised dormitory and provide fresh air. The two men, or rather the young man and the boy of about 12, made a strange sight in their torn and dirty city clothes. They picked at the stuffed courgettes Mayrig put before them. The older one spoke, in Armenian with what to me was a strange accent. "My name is Garabed Boyajian, my brother Bedros. We're from Kharput, perhaps you've heard of it." "I have," said Mayrig. "There's an Armenian school there, isn't there? Somewhere up north." "You've walked all this way?" "We have, but the issue is not us. The whole nation of Armenians in Cilicia is being destroyed. Most of our people are going quietly to their fate, like so many sheep. Some are refusing and have organized as fidais, resistance fighters. More than food and before talk, we need help, urgently. A trustworthy local person who is not afraid of undertaking a risky mission in the service of our nation, of Hayastan." I'd never heard anyone talk about Hayastan in that way. I knew it meant Armenia, but I was not sure where it was, or even if it was a place at all. I should add that Vartan and his family are what I guess are called Arapachos. They were living in Aleppo and spoke only Arabic, basically. But many of the family members had learned Armenian out of interest, but they didn't grow up speaking it in the book. Vartan finds out that his first love, Shushan, who's been interned in a refugee camp at Port Said in Egypt, is about to leave for America. He tries to find identity papers that would allow him to travel there and stop her, and turns to the head of the orphanage at Antura in Lebanon, Father Sarlou. He asks the priest about the orphanage. When the Young Turks decided to eliminate the Armenian stain from the Turkish motherland, there was a problem of what to do with the children who survived the deportations. I don't need to tell you anything about them, do I? Non, mon père. Well, it seems to be Jamal Pasha himself who had the idea of an orphanage for Armenian and a few Kurdish children, a sort of Turkification factory. The boys were all circumcised on arrival, yet another trauma for the poor lads. The punishment for speaking Armenian was known as falak, beating on the soles of the feet until they bleed. Little children. They were well fed in the beginning when the head of the orphanage was none other than Halide Edib, the Turkish Jeanne d'Arc, who is even now exciting crowds in Constantinople, one should say Istanbul now, with her nationalist oratory. There are pictures of Jamal posing with her on the front steps. Talat also visited. They were very proud of what they were doing. As the war went on and things began to go badly for the Ottomans, she and the other celebrity sponsors of this enterprise lost interest. Funds began to dry up. The place was administered by corrupt and brutal men who just wanted to skim off the money intended for the children's well-being and put it in their pockets. In October of last year, the Turks left for good, and we were allowed to return to a heartbreaking scene. We found about 400 children, all filthy and undernourished, many of them ill. Dozens had died of the diseases they already had, weakened by neglect and starvation. Other orphans of the massacres were brought here, so there are over 700 now. After 6 months, they're much better than they were. They're learning to speak Armenian again, those who had forgotten. But they're all deeply scarred. By the time the Turks left, they were totally confused about their identity. Their old Armenian names had been disfigured, preserving the first letters. Thus, Hartun Najarian became Hamid Nazim. Boros Merdanyan became Beki Mehmet, and so on. I felt an angry knot in the pit of my stomach. Is there a word, a name, for trying to totally obliterate a people, an entire nation, to make the children of murdered parents forget their origins and disappear into the ranks of the murderers? So, happy to take any questions if you like.
I'll take questions from the audience, but maybe I can start off. I read this book last summer, so I'm slightly rusty on some of the details, but what did strike me is that you say it's a novel, and then you put lots of photos in, and artworks, pictures of artworks, and you talk about a sea captain who rescues him, and then you put a photo of a sea captain in there. Are any of the photos to do with the real story, or what's the story behind these photos and these illustrations you've got?
Basically, they were taken from all over the place, and no, they're not personal photos, but I thought it would somehow make it a little bit more vivid for people reading about a time that's quite distant and places that they haven't seen. And there were, fortunately, photos in the book of the Sea Captain, where he talks about his adventures, which didn't...
That to me was proof that this was a real story.
Yeah, that's someone, not named Vartan, but he did carry spies up and down the coast and drop them off to go and do missions like he did.
Right. And was that Amo? The uncle that we...
No, that I'm afraid is a misconception in the sense that, as I said, I'd heard some of his stories and that inspired me to go and do research and to write this book. But in no way is that him. This is not his story.
Okay. If I may have one last question. Vartan talks about his entire life, but then goes into detail for only the first sort of 30 years. Is there a sequel being planned?
Someone just asked that today.
Oh, did they?
In an email. Not yet, no. I'd hoped that Vartan's reflections as an old man might give people clues about what had happened in between.